Hi, I'm Jeff Sachs, Director of the Earth Institute, and absolutely thrilled to welcome you to the Student Research Showcase. And I want to welcome, of course, our faculty, research leaders, partners and supporters of the Earth Institute, the general public, and especially the students. This is for you, and it's also to celebrate your achievements. The students, more than 100 of whom had the support of the Earth Institute this year. Of course, at the core of the Earth Institute's mission and of Columbia University's mission is education. And we're so proud of what the students are learning. But this is beyond education that you'll see today, because the contributions the students are making are huge. It's not only to their own learning, but contributions to knowledge and to the world. It is about problem solving in communities, in New York City, of course, and all over the world. So you see what you have before you are students from across the university who have operated across the globe, across the disciplines of sustainable development, and are making us so proud and making us so happy that this bold initiative of Columbia University, the Earth Institute, is seeing its purpose and its mission fulfilled so beautifully by our students. Well, thank you very much. Enjoy this wonderful showcase, and let's all give our gratitude, thanks, and celebration for the students whose research we learn about today.
My project was with the Millennium Villages project in Bonsaso, Ghana, and I primarily became interested because I'd expressed an interest in water issues and have had some background working on water projects in the past. And it was brought to my attention that one of the concerns of the MVP Bonsaso team was that they had noticed high incidences of malaria and diarrhea in some of their clusters. Was it from water storage? Was it from hygiene practices? Was it from polluted water sources? And so my project was primarily an assessment of all of these things to determine where the issues were in the cluster. We met a mother and her children as we went to one of the local wells that was in the area. Most people in the community have access to a borehole of some sort, either it's government or it's MVP installed. But there also exists some unprotected water sources like this borehole, which is down the bottom of, some valley, very steep, kind of treacherous. And the water is incredibly muddy, incredibly murky. And some of these are the types of water sources that people are using. Thankfully, she claimed not to be drinking this water, but still, even in washing clothes, there's so much bacteria and pathogens in there that is obviously unhealthy. So we talked to her, encouraged her to use some of the other water sources that were in the area. But obviously the reality of some of these things is that if I have a water source that's 5 minutes away from me, I'm not going to walk 30 minutes away to a better water source. And so those are some of the things we have to consider.
Well, for my project, I was in charge of writing training materials based on existing work at IRI, the International Research Institute for Climate and Society. They had done this technical strategy for integrating climate information services into malaria impact evaluations, and I was writing training manuals to train public health practitioners in how to use these climate services. And I found what was really, really difficult was actually understanding what makes a really good training manual. I mean, I'm a student, I've been a student, and I think I understand the material very well, but it's a whole nother thing to actually try and teach someone that material, which I found very challenging. My research was done at Lamont, which was beautiful to get out of the city, go up and over the George Washington Bridge, and work with the colleagues there at the Earth Observatory. I think that future interns will have a lot to do with this project because we've actually developed a full line of things that need to be done after this. We want to create a big package, a training package, for future workshops in the field. So future interns could plan these workshops in the field. For example, the IRI works extensively in East Africa and Tanzania, Ethiopia, which would be really enriching for a lot of interns that want real hands-on experience.
My project was working with the MVP Carraro site team on child nutrition and infant and young child feeding practices as a way to reduce stunting in the cluster. I originally became interested in child nutrition as a Peace Corps volunteer in Burkina Faso after my undergraduate degree, and this interest kind of continued through my studies at Columbia. I think first, with this project, it helped child nutrition and stunting become a little bit more of a priority and focus for the site team. And with kind of the work that we did, it provides them with a jumping off point to continue the work on nutrition and stunting. One example of one of the interventions is cooking demonstrations with women leaders and mothers in the community. And during this time, a community health worker or a woman leader leads a group of women in a porridge demonstration or a complementary food demonstration that using locally available ingredients but in a very nutritious way to show the mothers what they can use with local foods and also encourage them to properly feed their children.
And I'm working on the IRI's Meningitis Merit Initiative project, where we're using data to help policymakers and researchers understand how meningitis is spread in Africa's meningitis belt. So right now I'm studying political science and computer science, and this project was the perfect intersection. What we did was we took data from a whole plethora of databases and programmed different maps and data visualization projects so that policymakers and researchers would have the tools necessary to address the spread of meningitis. And the biggest thing that I found interesting was we created a map tracking relative humidity from the 1950s all the way to the present day. And what we found is that meningitis spreads mostly in the dry season when relative humidity is under 40%. And so being able to track exactly what regions, exactly what times of years it hits that threshold for being dry and seeing how it correlates with the spread of meningitis in that same time frame was really interesting for me.
I was working on a carbon sequestration risk assessment project geared at looking at the effects or the possible effects of a leak of sequestered CO2 from a deep geologic formation to a shallow drinking water aquifer. Carbon sequestration or carbon capture and storage is a particularly promising carbon mitigation option, and the Newark Basin is a promising place for it's speculated as a future sequestration site. So doing this project on site in a test well at Lamont and also using different rocks collected from different depths around the Newark Basin and doing lab incubation, we were really able to look at the potential effects of the dissolution of host aquifer material in the event of a carbon dioxide leak. So we were noticing these bubbles coming up from when we were pumping water after the incubation in this well. And I guess it kind of presented a little science project in itself because we were wondering, well, why are these bubbles coming up? Can we collect the air? Can we test for it? What gases in it? And it turned out it was nitrogen, which is what we filled the packers with. So that let us know that there was a leak, and we had to address that at the end of at the end of the study. But really, as I said, it was a great introduction to being a scientist and to thinking about how you can overcome things that go wrong in the lab or go wrong in the project, because each opportunity was a chance to really come up with some diagnostic, to come up with a little project in and of itself to figure out what's going on.
Basically what I was doing was I reviewed a bunch of samples that came from the Alaskan tundra that were sticky traps with bugs on them. And it was my job to go through and count how many bugs were on each trap, and then to perform some measurements to ultimately assess biomass patterns throughout the season. The reason that knowing when peak abundance occurs, it has to do with when the songbirds migrate to Alaska. Traditionally, when they come and they reproduce, that's the peak of abundance. So there's plenty of food for their populations to survive. But what has been a growing trend is, as the Arctic gets warmer, that peak is moving up earlier in the season. And when that happens, because birds migrate based on sunlight and not temperature, there's a trophic mismatch. So there's not enough food to feed the bird populations, and that's where they grow. So bird populations are decreasing. I absolutely think it's important for the Earth Institute to fund these projects. I mean, as a result of anthropogenic causes, climate change is an inevitability of our present and our future. Thus, understanding its effects in every region of the globe is going to prove crucial going forward in order to mitigate these effects as best we can.
My name is Jing Guo, and I'm looking at the relationship between ozone events, jet latitude, and storm counts in the eastern North America. Well, I really enjoy the fact that the research is, real-world research is very relevant right now, and with climate change being a big topic, and also to get involved in actually doing the data, looking at the data, finding the results. It's different from actually classwork, in which the professor usually already has the data set out and it's very clear and concise. These data can be very noisy. You can see your results and you have to figure out, is my result correct? Well, ozone is very important because over 108 million people live in areas that violate the National Ambient Air Quality Standard, and that can be really detrimental to health. So we looked at one of the processes that affect ozone events, and especially during the summer months. And we looked at jet latitude and storm counts because these events help sweep away air pollution from an area. So if we were able to find a connection between meteorology and air pollution, it can help us determine in the future how air pollution can vary in response to climate change, and also how often, how severe these events can be.
So what my project is trying to do is to understand how short-term climate variability, so mostly changes in rainfall, are affecting farmers' yields and agricultural production, and then trying to understand how farmers are shifting their behavior based on these changes in climate. I think the biggest challenge on the ground is having families that you're interviewing actually trust you. I have a few funny stories. One was I went into a village and everyone was convinced that I was part of the Indian tax collection agency. So they wanted to basically avoid talking to me. Or they would tell me that all of their crops failed, that they don't really have any money from agriculture. But then after spending more time in the communities, they began to realize that I was a student from the US, that I was doing research that would hopefully benefit them in the long term. So when I redid surveys, people were actually much more receptive, and they actually, I think, told me truthful answers. One of the regions that I'm working in is in central Gujarat in India, and this region is facing severe groundwater depletion. Currently, groundwater tables are at about 700 to 800 feet below ground, and this is declining at a rate of about 5 to 6 feet per year. And when we ask farmers, how long do you think that you'll be able to practice farming in the same capacity with groundwater? And most farmers said about 5 to 6 years. So it seems like current agricultural practices may be unsustainable, and we need to think of new ways.
Imagine in the future when we have a city that wants to be totally responsible on its actions on the environment, and it wants all of its citizens want to use renewable energy, which does not pollute the environment in one way or another. But how do we know that they do what they actually say? My project was about a carbon isotope laser detector. This device would help us to find out whether people who are using, let's say, fuel, that they're actually using renewable sources. Because when they're using fossil fuels, there will be carbon-12 and carbon-14 isotopes. These are particles that exist from thousands and thousands of years ago. So like when the dinosaurs were there, their particles are in this fossil fuel, in even the gasoline that we use today. And by using this device and looking at the smoke that comes out from a machine, from a factory, let's say, this device will be able to tell whether there is carbon isotopes in it or not.
So my project was implementing and designing a new CHW framework, a new management framework for the community health worker program in the Sauri Millennium Village cluster in Western Kenya. So the point of the program was to improve the management of the CHWs at a local level in order to improve health outcomes of the whole cluster. And so I originally became interested in healthcare management because not only is it ubiquitous globally anywhere you find any healthcare system, but it's also very important. It's a way that you can change and improve healthcare delivery without significant changes to the actual healthcare system itself. By better management, you can have better health outcomes without necessarily huge influxes of funding or anything like that. So any type of change is difficult. Trying to get a community to change or people to change their status quo is tough. So the biggest problem we ran into was buy-in from the local CHWs, but also the local facility staff and community. So the way that we fixed this problem was to really engage the community and existing CHWs in both the selection and training of the senior CHWs. And then we were able to really kind of alleviate any of the big questions to validity.
So our project involved working with a nonprofit group in the Dominican Republic, Hispaniola. They work with low-income communities of both Dominican and Haitian descent in communities that surround basically plantations, including sugarcane and rice. And so they have two kinds of programs. One is economic and microenterprise, and the other is education. And so the education program is a newer program, and they needed help working with how to upgrade capacity, how to have the staff trained to a higher level, and how to implement better curriculum. So given that myself and 3 other of my colleagues have a strong education background, they brought us in to come in and basically write a training protocol for the staff.
So one of the things that I learned through this project was about operating in a very difficult socioeconomic context. The community we were working in, called Bate Libertad in the Dominican Republic, is a community made up of Dominicans, but many are of Haitian descent and also Haitian migrant workers. And as such, they're very marginalized from society, and they have a lot of trouble getting the proper documentation they need. And so I think this adds an added level of complexity to an already challenging situation where you have high unemployment, low educational status, and poor health outcomes.
It's very important to bring a host of best practices into any development context, whether that be education or environment or agriculture. But also, in a developing context, it's very difficult sometimes to implement all best practices because there'll be some foundational aspects that are just not available. So for example, one of the best practices that I was recommending to the NGO was creating a monitoring and evaluation system for teachers and managers that includes Spanish language high-level literacy tests with multiple versions. But unfortunately, those aren't available at an expert level in multiple versions, and we don't have the expertise to implement. So it shows kind of the constraints and limits that one can encounter in a developing context.
I think I still want to be a consultant in the development practice area. And I think what I've already done in the community, particularly Liberty, will basically help me a lot in the future, because I just like communicate with the people in the community, and that kind of experience I have never like experienced in my previous life. So it's kind of very good chance for me to just do some research on the ground instead of just imagine something.
I think it's crucial for Earth Institute to continue funding projects like this, with particular because of its focus in education. Education sometimes gets sidelined to bigger infrastructure projects or economic development. Literacy in particular is a strength and a skill that people can take with them wherever they go, can't be diminished, and really helps strengthen their own agency. Once someone has really functional literacy, they're able to go on and learn what they're interested in, whether it's agricultural practices, civic engagement, political participation. With those basic skills, literacy skills, that Earth Institute helps fund the cultivation of within Vate Libertad. There's an incredible amount of growth, participant-directed growth that can happen. So it's crucial that education projects in particular are something that the Earth Institute continues to invest in.
We're writing a case study for the Columbia University Case Consortium, and the case study is focusing on the resettlement of a town in the Peruvian Andes by a Chinese mining company, Chinalco.
So I worked with Mariana Costa, and she is a colleague that is doing the same program, the Masters in Development Practice. And Mariana is actually originally from Peru, so I had some exposure to the extractive sector, and she of course understood the Peruvian context really well, so we had a very integrated team.
The city that they're trying to resettle is called Morococha, and right now around 70% of the population of the city has moved to the new town that has been built by the mining company, which is like 7 kilometers away from it. The problem is that there's like a 30% of the population in Morococha that doesn't want to leave. But since the regional government has agreed to the resettlement, all the public services have been already moved and resettled to the new town. So you have around 1,000 people that are left in Morococha, and they don't have access to services anymore. That church, for example, that is a central icon and social center for the city, has been closed down. So one of the pictures we have shows a woman from the town, and on the background you can see the church, and you can see that the entrance has been blocked because it has been moved to the new city.
Well, given the fact that it's happening right now, there is still a lot to see. So the project or our case study will end in this moment, but a lot will be happening in the next few years, and a lot of lessons for Peru, for the extractive industry, for Latin America. And we think that this project can definitely be continued, and it is a case that is so relevant that it must be studied if we want to understand best practices in terms of how a resettlement process must take place, how a dialogue needs to be conducted, and also how communities need to be consulted and compensated when big mining operations are taking place.
My project was about the motivations for participation in an environmental services program in Nicaragua. The Limay Community Carbon Project is a program that provides payments to farmers who plant trees on underutilized areas of their land. And my question focuses specifically on the motivations regarding trust and environmental awareness. The biggest challenge I encountered was trying to get to some of the outlying communities I had planned to go. The terrain in some areas is so rocky that it's passable only by foot or on horseback. So accessibility is a huge issue in the region. Luckily, I was able to overcome this issue by doing more of my interviews on the weekends when people from these remote communities would tend to come into the town. Nicaragua receives about 25% of its GDP in foreign aid, so I'd really like to investigate how previous experiences with other NGOs influence farmers' perceptions of the Limay Community Carbon Project, and to what degree these perceptions influence their decision to participate.
So most developing countries have states that are weaker than we generally think of states. States that are unable to provide goods, to provide security, or that abuse taxation and abuse their monopoly of violence. So the big question I'm asking is, where do states come from? How do they arise from organizations that have the means of violence? And to do that, I look at armed groups, at criminal organizations in Eastern Congo, and I collect data from 1990 on what these criminal organizations have been doing in the villages, the taxation systems that they have established, the public goods they have provided. Eastern Congo is an area where the central state is relatively absent, so there is a proliferation of these armed groups. So what I'm actually looking is at the economic determinants that push these criminal organizations to form small state-like organizations in the villages. I love photography, so what I've done a lot is actually capturing faces and looks of the people I've worked with, both villagers and surveyors, that I think capture a lot both the hardness of their daily life as well as the humanity that is underlying. When one does research in post-conflict settings, like in Eastern Congo, one is often seen as someone with an economic agenda or a political agenda, and is seen with suspicion. At the same time, the locals are often seen as individuals who only care about you because you have dollars and you're an outsider. The most rewarding part of this research is that you have to establish long-term human relationships with a group of surveyors, with locals, with villagers, that force you to go beyond these preconceived ideas that each side has of each other, and actually establish true relationships that were completely unaccepted from people from very different worlds.
Our project investigates the oldest Chinese mining project in South America, which is in Peru, and we're trying to figure out why there are labor conflicts for 20 years and whether there is potential for resolving these conflicts. I will be interested in this because I'm a Chinese foreign reporter that focuses on Chinese overseas investment. We were the first researchers ever to be able to talk to the Chinese managers in that Chinese mining companies because we have the leverage of I being a Chinese journalist writing for important newspaper. And we found out understanding gap is really an important element in these conflicts. While we know that Chinese company, they lack the understanding of the outside world also lack the understanding about the Chinese companies. And we found this communication gap is crucial, it's huge, and it's mutual. I believe there are already a lot of researchers doing a lot of research in the world, but there are not enough development practitioners to solve the real problems. And we think it's important that although our projects are not very academic, it's still important to find out why are the problems and how to resolve it.